Hey everyone, Nathan here. Absurd Being is finally back, and this series is going to be dedicated to Kierkegaard. So we'll break down his philosophy, and hopefully by the time we finish, you'll have a good understanding of what Kierkegaard was about. So just a note first on the way that I'm going to approach this. Kierkegaard didn't write like a single magnum opus, if you like, which contained all of his thoughts in a kind of tidy package, like Being in Nothingness for Sartre or Being in Time for Heidegger. So it was nice and easy for those guys. I could just take the book and just work my way through it, break it down, get into the weeds with them. But Kierkegaard's not going to work like that because his ideas are kind of spread out over a number of different books. So what I've done is read through those different books and and basically summarized them, and then put those summaries together, so I have one whole picture of Kierkegaard's philosophy, and that's what I'll be presenting in this video series, my summary of my summaries of Kierkegaard's books. Yeah, I think that's pretty much all I wanted to say on that. So in this video, what I'm going to do is just go through Kierkegaard, a little bit about Kierkegaard, a short biography. Then we'll look at the different books that I read, and I'll just briefly talk about each book, just so you get a feel for them. And then finally, I'll stick up the diagram that I put together, which kind of summarizes Kierkegaard at a glance, and that'll be the touchstone that I'll use in giving these in making these videos, where we'll just focus on different points in that diagram, and hopefully when we finish it will all come together seamlessly. That's the plan. So Kierkegaard, what was he like? What was his life like? Let's have a quick look. He was born in Copenhagen in 1813, and he died in 1855 at the tender age of 42. He was the youngest of 7 children, and all of his siblings died before Kierkegaard turned 21. He inherited a small fortune after his father died in 1838, and this let him continue his writings and pursue his career as a freelance writer. So he had the leisure that that small fortune afforded him. Now he was obsessed over things like guilt, sin. He was very melancholic and depressed, and these are traits that he inherited from his father. And he also inherited a curious belief that God was out to punish his father by ensuring that none of his children lived beyond the age of 33. And Kierkegaard believed that he would not survive 33. And funnily enough, the text, the book that he thought would be the last book he would ever write, was when he was 33 in 1846, and that was concluding Unscientific PostScript. And in it, he comes as close as he ever does to putting everything together, all of his philosophy, kind of squeezing the last juicy goodness out of everything that he wrote, and kind of putting it all together in that one place. And it reads like, he was trying to wrap up, basically. And then I guess to his dismay, he lived for another nine years or so. So he went on and did some more writing. The most impactful event in Kierkegaard's life took place when he was in 1837, when he met Regine Olsen, who was only 14, 10 years younger than Kierkegaard at the time. But they fell in love and became engaged in 1840. So everything was apparently going smoothly, although it turned out not to have been going so smoothly, because in August the following year, Kierkegaard broke off the engagement, and this turned out to be a huge pivotal moment for him, and it stayed with him for the rest of his life. And he wrote about this same event in some of his fictitious works. I'm thinking of in particular Repetition and Stages on Life's Way, in which there's a man, an individual who gets engaged, really genuinely loves the woman that he's engaged to marry, but nevertheless decides to break it off. And the reason is usually something along the lines of the guy's too depressed, he's prone to melancholy and kind of withdrawn and inward directed, and thinking that he will be unable to provide his future wife, his fiancée, with happiness, that she'll end up being unhappy, and he will have been the reason for that. And so despite the fact that he loves his fiancée, he breaks it off in both of those two books, those fictitious accounts, which very strangely mirror Kierkegaard's own situation. And he also talks about marriage in a couple of places, either or, and again in Stages on Life's Way, he has someone give an exposition on the virtues of marriage and how good it is. So he was always obsessed with this this event. It stayed with him, I think, for a long time, and perhaps he never got over it. And it seems like that's the reason why he ended up breaking up with Regine. He probably felt that, he possibly felt like he wouldn't have been able to continue his studies and his writing. The life of a husband and father would get in the way of that. But I think more likely it's that he recognized he was going to be unable. Just his his disposition, his personality, it was not conducive to a happy life for Regine in the end. So he broke it off with her. And just one final note on that. Before he died, he confided apparently to a friend that he regretted not marrying and taking on an official position. So take from that what you will. That was Kierkegaard. So by way of a kind of a quote that captures Kierkegaard's philosophy as a whole, I just ran across this when I was going through my notes on, what was it? I forget the title now. The Sickness Unto Death. And I came across this passage and I thought it really, this is the summation of Kierkegaard. So I'll just throw it at you now. Christian heroism, and indeed one perhaps sees little enough of that, is to risk unreservedly being oneself, an individual human being, the specific individual human being alone before God, alone in this enormous exertion and this enormous accountability. So I think that really just that's what Kierkegaard was all about. He was about getting to this point, getting to the, if you know Kierkegaard at all, you've got the three spheres of existence: aesthetic, ethical, and religious. He was about getting to that religious stage. That was where, that was the only stage that mattered. Getting to that God relationship, becoming an individual standing before God. That is everything that Kierkegaard kind of circles in all of his writings, even if he doesn't explicitly talk about it, although he does explicitly talk about it a lot. So that's kind of Kierkegaard, and this will, as we go on, the videos, I hope will flesh out that quote. So the works that I've covered here, I read most of his pseudonymous writings, which, and the majority of them took place between 1843 and 1846. And there's one that I read from 1849 as well. So I'll just go through and break down each of those books very briefly in just a moment. Like I said at the beginning, there's no single magnum opus. They all deal with slightly different topics, but all revolving around the religious sphere, getting to that final point. And I'll just discuss this as well while I'm here. Why did Kierkegaard write so many of his books under pseudonyms? And people have speculated on this, and you don't really need to, because he tells us in concluding Unscientific PostScript why he does this. It's to distance himself from the reader. He doesn't want a direct relationship, like a teacher-student relationship, or a writer, an author-reader relationship. He wants to, what he's trying to teach is inwardness. It's how to be that individual standing alone before God. And he can't do that, he thinks, via direct transmission, by telling you what to do, the way things are. Because if he does that, then you have as the audience have a direct relationship with him, not with God. And you're not developing yourself, but you're as that individual, you're developing yourself in kind of my reflection, or his reflection as the author. And so that's why all of his books are couched in pseudonyms, and even the books aren't even written by a single pseudonym sometimes. There's the pseudonym who published the book isn't the author. He kind of found the manuscript somewhere, and he's just publishing them. He doesn't even know the author sometimes, or sometimes the author is given, but we don't know anything about him or her, and it's all this subterfuge and mystery. And that's why he's trying to create this distance. He's trying to create the separation, so that it's more about you or us as the readers, rather than about him as the author or the teacher. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later in a bit more detail when we talk about subjective and the objective. But for now, let's just have a look at the books that I covered. So the first was Either Or in 1843, and in this basically Kierkegaard discusses or outlines the first two realms, the first two spheres, the aesthetic and the ethical. At the very end, he does give a short glimpse into the religious sphere with a short writing by a priest friend of well, it is quite complicated actually, and maybe I'll just go into this in a bit more detail, the relationships here. So the whole thing, Either Or, is not written by Kierkegaard. It's not written by the person whose name appears on the book either. His name is Victor Eremita. He didn't write either or. He just collected the manuscripts that appear in the book. He collected them and published them. So there's him. So that's the first layer. It's divided into two parts, either or. The first part is deals with the aesthetic sphere. And there are a bunch of essays and diary entries of a reflective aesthete. But we don't know his name. His name is just A. So we call him A in the book. And there's also, at the end of this section, there's another diary called The Seducer's Diary. And this is written by a guy whose name we do know, Johannes. Johannes the Seducer is what he's called. So that's the first part. And the second part are a set of letters written by a judge called William. And what's interesting is that these letters are written to A from the first section. So the aesthete from the first section. And the judge is describing or trying to extol the virtues of the second sphere, the ethical sphere, specifically as it regards marriage. So this is the depth of Kierkegaard's pseudonymous writings. Starts with Victor Eremita, who collects all the information together, and then you've got an unnamed author, A. You've got Johannes in The Seducer's Diary, and then you've got the judge writing the letters concerning the ethical sphere. And just to top it all off, the very last section is a short section written by a priest who is a friend of the judge, a priest who's a friend of William's. We don't know his name, we're not told his name, but he gives a kind of taste of what's coming in the religious sphere. So you've got either or deals with the aesthetic, the ethical, and it just gives a hint of what's coming in the religious. So anyway, and the whole thing there, like I said, captures really quite nicely the way that Kierkegaard wanted to distance himself from the reader. So everything that he's doing is through indirect communication rather than direct. So the second book was Fear and Trembling, written in 1843. And this is basically an attempt to explain how Abraham, despite having been prepared to sacrifice his son Isaac, is nevertheless still the paradigm of faith. And yeah, so that's Fear and Trembling. The third book was Repetition, published in the same year. This was written by a guy called Constantine Constantius, and it has describes someone who, like I was talking about at the beginning with Kierkegaard and Regine, someone who falls in love, gets engaged, and decides to break it off. And he discusses the reasons and why and how it all went awry, all within the central theme of repetition, which is an important term for Kierkegaard and one we'll talk about as the videos go on. The next book is Philosophical Crumbs or Philosophical Fragments, which was published the next year, 1844. And this is purely Christian. This one, all he's trying to do is answer a single question here, which he says is, can an eternal consciousness have a historical point of departure? And he's obviously getting there at the way that in Christianity God was born and had a life as Jesus. So the way that an eternal divine being enters the earthly realm, enters the world world of the temporal and the finite, and the way that's a paradox. Can we base our eternal happiness on such an event that happened in history? And he really just builds up Christianity there. The next book was published in the same year, 1844, The Concept of Anxiety. He analyzes anxiety here, but only to get a glimpse into sin, really. That's an important secondary focus. And the next book was Stages on Life's Way. This is quite long. It's published in 1845, and this is like Either Or. It's actually the sequel to Either Or, and it's just as the publishing and the authorship is just as convoluted as Either Or was, if not more. But it's broken down basically into 4 parts. The first part kind of revisits the aesthetic sphere. The second part revisits the ethical sphere. And the third part, Guilty, Not Guilty, is the longest part. It's another diary story, or it's diary excerpts, I guess, or perhaps the complete diary, I'm not sure. But it's presented in diary form anyway. And it's that same old story. A man falls in love with a woman, breaks it off because he feels he's unable to fulfill his fiance's hopes, what she would hope for in a happy marriage, and just fleshing out really though the religious aspects of this, the religious expression that comes through here. So he's kind of bringing this full circle with the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. The next book was Concluding Unscientific PostScript in 1846. This is definitely the most comprehensive account of Kierkegaard's philosophy. Like I said at the beginning, was intended to be the last of his writings. And the frame of this book is essentially it's the subjective and the objective. And the subjective is where Kierkegaard has been focused in all of his writings. It's that inward, that individual standing before God. That's the subjective. So we'll talk about this, that particular dynamic, objective and subjective, those opposites, in the next video, I think. But offers the fullest account of the spheres and the way we ought to behave in order to progress through to the religious. He also gives a really decent summary of his of everything he's written up until that point. So a good book to read. And finally was The Sickness Unto Death, written in 1849, and he deals with despair and sin in this book. So the last thing I want to do here really is just throw up or give my top 3. If you're going to read Kierkegaard, 'cause this was one of the things I found that was kind of difficult at when I was getting into Kierkegaard, was what should I read? You know, there were all these books out there. I had no idea which books were kind of central to his philosophy, which were more extraneous. And if I was going to go back and redo it again, well, I'd probably read all of them. But if you don't have the time or you don't have the inclination to go into that depth, there are 3 that you have to read. The first one is Either Or. So you've got to get that aesthetic and the ethical. You've got to get that picture in your head. So Either Or is good for that. Then Fear and Trembling. That is like a stepping stone to the religious. He talks about the religious in that, and starts to flesh out what the religious is, and finally concluding Unscientific PostScript. You need to read that. You don't need to have read, it's the PostScript to the philosophical fragments, but you don't have to have read philosophical fragments first. It's totally unnecessary. But concluding gives you the whole picture, I think, as much as one can say the whole picture in a single book with Kierkegaard. So those are the three that, if you want to read Kierkegaard, you should. And I think that's me. And I forgot the most important part, the diagram, the thing you've all been waiting for, I'm sure. So let me get that up now. As you can see, I've just tried to summarize everything. I've got a few arrows in there it's not exact. It's not an exact science, this, but it just hopefully gives a feel for what Kierkegaard talks about. I'm not going to go into any discussion at the moment, but I just wanted to give it to you there. And each video, I'll pull this up and we'll just kind of work our way through the different sections I've outlined there. So the next video we'll get stuck into Kierkegaard's philosophy itself. Until then, thanks for listening to me rambling on about his books and him, and I will catch you very shortly to get into the weeds. Thanks again, guys. See ya.